good evening. Thanks for joining us virtually tonight. My name is Maddie Walters, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm pleased to introduce this virtual event with Kenneth Rosen, presenting his new book, Troubled, in conversation with Sylvia Harvey. Through virtual events like tonight, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to you and others in our community during these challenging times. Every week, we're hosting events here on our Zoom, and as always, our event schedule appears on our website at harvard.com/events, where you can also sign up for our weekly email newsletter and browse our shelves from home. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers at any time tonight, go to the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get through as many as we can. In the chat box during this presentation, you'll see a link to purchase tonight's books online. All sales through this link support Harvard Bookstore, so thank you for your support during this trying time for community spaces like your local bookstores. You will also find a link to donate in the chat box. Your purchases and contributions make this virtual author series possible, and now more than ever supports the future of a landmark independent bookstore. Thank you for tuning in support of our authors and the incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And finally, as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings through the past year, technical issues may arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them quickly. Thank you for your patience and understanding. And now I'm pleased to introduce tonight's speakers. Kenneth Rosen is a senior editor and correspondent for Newsweek based in Italy, and has formerly written for Wired and the New York Times, among other publications. He received the Bayeux Calvados Normandy Award for War Correspondence for his reporting on Iraq in 2018, and is a two-time finalist for the Livingston Award in International Reporting. His previous book, Bulletproof Vest, was named one of the most fascinating books Wired read in 2020. Sylvia Harvey is an award-winning journalist reporting on race, class, policy, and incarceration. She is the author of The Shadow System, Mass Incarceration and the American Family, a searing expose of the effects of the mass incarceration crisis on families. She is the recipient of a National Headliner Award and a National Association of Black Journalists Salute to Excellence Award, and her work has appeared in The Nation, Politico, and the Marshall Project, Color Lines, NPR, and more. Tonight, they're here to discuss Ken's new book, Troubled, The Failed Promise of America's Behavioral Treatment Programs, a New York Times book to watch for. They praise it as not just a work of extended empathy, but a public service. These life stories, taken together, shine a light on an industry that has been able to thrive in darkness. I am so pleased to turn things over to tonight's speakers, Ken and Sylvia. The digital podium is all yours.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So first,
Hi, Sylvia.
congratulations. I'm so excited that we are here for Troubled. And I know everybody's excited to hear so much more about it. It's been, 4 years since we were at Cary? 4 years. So, and I know the book has changed a lot since then, right? I think at that time, you were looking at it from the perspective of it being a memoir. And now, it's not a memoir. So if you would just tell our audience all about Troubled, right? Like, what is this industry that not too many people know about?
Sure. Yeah, I think so. The Troubled is a chronicling of youth in turmoil, right? It charts the trajectory of 4 children who go through what are known as tough love or emotional growth schools and programs, beginning with wilderness therapy into therapeutic boarding school, and then a residential lockdown facility, or sometimes a ranch. And that's generally the trajectory of troubled teens who are sent away by their parents to these programs. They go through this gauntlet of programs. So the book charts the path of these 4 young people, and then goes a little bit further to find out what happened to them many years later. The crux of the book is essentially that I was one of those teens when I was 16 and 17. I was on a rebellious streak when I was younger. I was doing recreational drugs, and I was skipping school, and being combative and just overall difficult for my mother, who was caring for me at the time. And my mother and my father decided to send me away to these programs. So the book is bookended by this story of my own experience in these programs, but I use it as a conduit to tell the broader story about this industry, which since the early aughts has grown into $1 billion juggernaut of healthcare and mental health care for young people. The problem with the industry now is that we're seeing a lot of stories of abuse and physical restraint, things that have led to the deaths of many people within these programs. They have been investigated for many years, but never quite shuttered completely. And the book, Troubled, hopes to sort of correct the record that the programs aren't really a great space in which to treat anxiety or depression or someone who might be on the spectrum or being difficult at home. Congregate care doesn't work. And unfortunately, the children in this book don't end up exactly how they were promised to end up, the way the parents were told that they would, based on what the programs were offering. So it's a personal endeavor, the book. It was a journalistic endeavor. I interviewed more than 100 former clients of these programs, their parents, industry leaders, psychologists, counselors, child's rights advocates to paint a picture of this industry, because there hadn't been one up until this point. What we see is a sort of hidden narrative. If you Google troubled teen, you'll see mostly this glowing, really lovely, atmospheric therapy, happiness, children blossoming into adults that the industry has put out there. But there's this sub-narrative of all the troubles that come to these kids later. And that was my earnest hope with Troubled, was to give the other side that voice, which they hadn't had for many years. Now with the release of Paris Hilton's documentary, this is Paris, in which she chronicles her own time in these programs and the difficulties she's faced since then. We're seeing a lot more stories come out about children who have suffered greatly, both abuse within the programs and then the long-term effects of PTSD and CPTSD stemming from these programs. So there's been a lot of interest around the release of the book, and I'm really excited to talk about it in large part with you, because your own book really talked about a pipeline in itself and sort of the struggles that families face by having someone who's incarcerated and in the family, and sort of dealing with those external wants and needs that aren't being met because the family is still so disparate. So I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with me, and I'm sure it'll be a mutual conversation here.
Of course. I mean, what I found really fascinating in reading the book, and I'd love for you to just tell the audience a little bit of what does it mean to be troubled, right? When we're thinking about troubled, it really depends on what and who we're looking at. Like, what demographic are we looking at? We're saying these are troubled children. Like, what are these troubled children doing? Like you said, is it recreational drug use? Is it just cutting class? Is it talking back to mom? Is it not going to church? Like, what is it? And also, these programs, when we talk about wilderness programs, like, what does that look like? What does that mean? What are these young people doing when they're taken away in the middle of the night, as you describe in your book? Literally, you're asleep, and next thing you know, you're being snatched from your bed and taken up to, the mountains. Like, why are they being taken up there, and what's happening up there? And then obviously, after just giving our listeners a little bit of perspective on what that looks like, I think we could transition quite easily into how that contributes to the prison pipeline, right? Like, and also how much it costs, because some of these programs are as expensive as a year at Harvard. So
right. So the troubled teen is a really bad moniker, I think. I think it is a self-fulfilling prophecy in the end. If you label someone troubled, they're more likely to just be troubled, especially someone who's so impressionable as a young person. But troubled, the way people view troubled teens is anywhere from someone who's being a little bit disruptive in class or not going to school, to someone who's really off the rails and doing heavy drugs and not going to school and fighting and being physically violent or sexually deviant. A lot of things that concern parents. And there are issues at home. There are issues with the children that need addressing. I'm not saying that there's no such thing as a troubled teen, but I think to call someone troubled is to negate the fundamental issues that are making them troubled, right? To say that they're just acting out, but not looking at maybe there's a depression component here, maybe there's an anxiety component here, maybe there's abuse that isn't being seen by the parent component that isn't being addressed. Rather, they issue a blanket statement calling a teen troubled and sort of damning them into their adulthood. So that's what generally troubled means. And you mentioned that they get carted away in the middle of the night. So these troubled teens are viewed as sort of these flight risks, right? Which is a term we use in the criminal justice system and elsewhere. That they might run away if you ask them to go into treatment, or if you propose a sort of alternative method to schooling, which these programs purport to be the better solution. So with that flight risk, parents hire what are known as transporters or escorts to come in the middle of the night and take a child from their bed forcefully and ship them off to a program, generally out of state, generally many hundreds of thousands of miles away. For me, that first program was 9 hours north in upstate New York. I was living in New Jersey at the time, and they took me at 2 a.m. This has been a fundamental problem with the industry for many years. The fact that the rest of the therapy is sort of tainted and colored with this one night of trauma, that a child is asleep in their bed in what was supposed to be a safe space, and then all of a sudden it's become a dangerous, tormented area in which they can no longer function by virtue of being kidnapped. So they're taken to these programs, and you ask sort of what happens at these programs. There's this sort of, like I said, a gauntlet through which people go through. Generally, you go through wilderness and then a residential program. The wilderness is meant to prepare you for these types of programs, meant to groom you into understanding the level system, the things that you need to do in order to get out, sort of how to operate and how to accept the therapy, how to accept the program. In the day-to-day lives of these children seem very normal on paper. The wilderness program, you're hiking all day. If you see an itinerary that the programs give out to parents, it's very simple. You have breakfast, you have a truth circle in the morning. They call it, like a therapy gathering. And then you go for a 5-10 mile hike, and then you have lunch, and then, so it seems very innocuous, but throughout that day are issuances of psychological beratement. You're meant to sort of turn against your fellow clients, the other children in the program, in order to advance your own program to get you home, right? Because that's what most children want. In one instance, children are made to journal in the middle of the night, a journal just before dinner. They're supposed to write a 1-page journal, and if the journal doesn't meet sort of a psychological standard, if you're not wrangling with your own justifications and rationalizations and trying to pin yourself for being bad and figuring out how you got so bad, you're not going to get dinner. And if you do write it well, maybe you'll get salt, right? So you're sort of fighting for these civil liberties and these simple things that are otherwise granted to even prisoners, but they're completely stripped of this. They're entered to the program. They're strip searched. They're made to squat and into a catcher stance and cough. They're take all of their personal belongings are taking. One character in the book, I know she had a hair tie, and even that was taken and replaced with one from the program. So you're really dehumanized in so many different ways, as to become the one thing that they say you are, which is troubled. You're just sort of in the space of torment and detriment and really caustic youth. So that's the introduction to the program, and that's only the first few hours, let alone what comes later.
Yeah. So what obviously I think is really interesting about this is that it's almost a completely different world, right? I think for me, writing The Shadow System, it was largely in part thinking about what is mass incarceration and how many people outside of the directly impacted and the criminal justice sort of advocates know about it, right? If we're thinking about the prison system, we're thinking, oh, Black, brown, and white poor may know about this system, right? May be living this system, may be, aware of what's happening, understand the statistics, understand what's going on, whereas the larger sort of society doesn't necessarily know. I think now, maybe over the last 5 years, specifically since the new Jim Crow, the idea of mass incarceration as an idea is something people understand. It's like, oh, that's this really bad thing. There are all these people that are being put in prison. Most of them are Black and brown. Most of them are poor. There's a lot of discrimination, so you have some idea of what's going on, right? So I think that one of the things that I thought was really interesting is, not knowing much about this troubled teen and this rehabilitation industry coming from a completely different side of criminal justice, but being able to see that, oh, there's actually this whole other world that you don't necessarily know about, but you can still, understand and empathize and see all of the different sort of things that are taking place that help them also, to some degree, end up in that same pipeline, right? I think that obviously for me, I look at, if I look at one of the young men in my book, Randall is 20 years old when he is convicted of murder for, he's sentenced to life without the possibility of parole, and it's for a murder conviction. And he's 20. And so for me, the idea is like, oh yeah, as like you'd say, this troubled teen, like, yeah, it's this troubled young person. And he even said to me, he was like, why would you write about me? Because I'm not a sympathetic character. Right. And I explained to him, like, it's not about being sympathetic, it's about being truthful, and it's about presenting somebody that is multifaceted. Right. So that meant for me going back into his life, going back to, when he was growing up in Overtown, Miami, and what kind of resources were available, what kind of education was available, where his mother was, whether she worked 3 jobs on the other side of town, like how all of the lack of resources contributed to his outcome, right? And then when we're in school, we're looking at, okay, you get into a fight at school, and instead of being taken to the principal's office or, sat down by a teacher, you're taken to jail, right? So you're arrested and you're not even 13. So that link to the criminal legal system has started so early that there's already a lens on you as troubled, a lens on you as someone that is going to go down a certain path, right? They're already thinking of you in a way you already don't have resources. So you've been incarcerated, and once you get out of juvenile hall, you're put into an alternative school. In an alternative school, you have access to drugs quite easily. You have access to all of the, in quotes, troubled children, right? So that's where you congregate. That's where you figure out how to get into, in quotes, more trouble, right? So there's no wonder that, 5 years later, he's convicted of murder because you were, in a drug war, in a turf war, and you believed that something that couldn't possibly belong to you, like land in this country, was yours, right? And so we have a man that's dead, we have a man that's in prison for the rest of his life at 20. And then he has a daughter that is in utero, right? So what does all of that do, to a person, to a family, to a community, and how it all starts from this notion that this person is troubled, this notion that this person doesn't deserve to be heard, this person, let's throw them away quite easily and quite early.
That's so right. And I don't make that connection in the book, but it is always a product of the environment, right? This isn't just some miraculous thing that happens. People aren't, I believe, born bad, right? There's no way that you just end up becoming a convicted murderer because you were born that way. So there's enough evidence to suggest that, yeah, this is a product of the environment. And then, of course, as you know, if you're arrested early on and you have a record and a reputation, and then you said you're not fit for this society, we're going to move you to an alternative school, or in this case, therapeutic boarding school, where you're congregating with all these other troubled people. Your only sort of barometer for your future is more troubled people. And I don't want to say that being in small therapy groups with other people who are struggling is the same thing. This is very different. We're talking about, you and I are talking about, like, institutions that are meant to keep people apart from society. And I think that that's a major problem. And that's sort of like, you mentioned earlier on that sort of understanding that the general public has about incarceration and healthcare for children, is that it seems like it's on the fringe. Oh, that's a different class, right? That's not what I would deal with. Or my children's not like that. My children is not. My children are not like that. My child is not like that. They would never end up that way. So that's not a problem for me. There has to be some way that we connect the issues that are facing the kids and the children and these young people to more of an understanding of the general public. I think in the case of criminal justice, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think a lot of the disenfranchisement has been something that is really tangible to people. Like, oh, I get to vote, and I understand not being able to vote. And so therefore I can sort of connect to that. Otherwise, there's a real disassociation from what that means to be effective for the rest of your life. And same goes for the children who, maybe their parents didn't have a troubled streak when they were younger. Maybe they towed the line, had good grades. And so they see someone who's acting out, who's having a difficult time in an era of heightened anxiety, heightened depression. There's just this brutality of online abuse, even, the way people talk to each other online is grotesque. And they don't get it. And the only way that they see fit to fix the child or the problem person is to remove them completely from society. in the same breath wanting them to return to that society without ever being given the tools to really flourish within that community. So these programs that are in my book and are these congregate care things that never work, but there are options for bringing it back to the community, to really focusing the effort on keeping someone from going to an alternative school and finding their way into a turf war and eventually committing a crime that is terrifying. I mean, nobody wants that for any child, but unfortunately it's that slow burn, right? I mean, one thing leads to another, and you are not so conscious of those benchmarks, of those small little milestones that are adding up to create this sort of deviation from the normal path.
Mhm. Yeah. So, in thinking about the cost of these programs that you talk about, right? Because I think there's this huge sort of idea around what it means to live in poverty, what it means to exist, in a space where you have a low socioeconomic um, income or status, right? We always talk about the poor and the disenfranchised, but in your book, you talk about. I mean, there's a range, and I was actually pretty impressed. Where I think one of the clients actually like took out loans and really figured out a way to come up with the money to get the child into this program, right? And also recognizing that it wasn't, it was Black, it was white, it kind of spanned the board. But in terms of the cost, like just talk to us about how much some of those programs cost and what you think could be, how could that money be better served for that young person, for just anything really? Because I mean, I was quite shocked at the cost of some of the programming.
Yeah, the characters in the book, I tried very deliberately to span the gamut of the range of sort of class, and so
Yeah.
many people chalk up these programs to privileged kids, and it's just not the reality. There are so many instances of foster children being put in these programs, of court-appointed people being put in these programs. Yes, there are the people who are paying cash outright to fund these programs, but in large part, it's more nuanced than that. Some of the programs cost anywhere from $500 a day to $800 a day. I make the comparison that the education or the treatment they receive oftentimes is the equivalent of a semester at an Ivy League institution. I mean, $35,000, $40,000 a year in the hopes of saving a child. It's a tough thing to square when you have people who are so willing to dump this amount of money into the care for children that is ending up not being actual care, that it's not evidence-based, that insurance companies aren't willing to cover these sorts of programs because they have been proven to not work. And you asked whether I have any sort of alternatives to how that money or what to do with that money, or how we can improve the situation for the children in turmoil. It just seems to me that putting that money back into the community would be the biggest help. I mean, if there was a way to fund community efforts to keep people at home, to really investigate the family unit and look for ways to strengthen that family unit, to strengthen the child rather than to diminish their abilities, would be the best way forward. I undertook the book as a journalist, as a person who went to these programs, but I have tried very hard not to issue sort of legislative agendas or advocate for one thing or another, because I really know that I stepped into this story a lot with my own personal narrative, and I want to step out and say, this is me sharing my story and the story of hundreds of others, and it needs to be heard. And I'm hoping that the right people are listening. I know that Senator Gessler in Oregon is doing great work on this, looking at these programs and how to better regulate them. There's new legislation in Utah, which is I'm not quite clear on how well that'll help the industry, but there does seem to be movement around caring more about these programs. There have been in the past, but I think there's renewed interest in large part thanks to the Paris Hilton documentary that I mentioned and my book. So strengthening the community is imperative to the success of anyone. Even with criminal justice, the fact that we have so many police officers who are answering calls of mental distress is far and beyond the right way, in my opinion, to address sort of a socioeconomical difference. Right, you have the sort of another caste system growing there, where the occupier is addressing the native. It's all sort of backward, and the more that we're able to reshuffle efforts into building those communities, about bringing it back centralized to a population rather than sort of dispersing it and outsourcing and exporting it. I think we'll see at least marginal improvements among our youth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's important to even acknowledge that, we're here as the reporters, as the journalists, even people that are bringing personal experience to the stories. And I think that, sometimes that does kind of get lost on people. They're like, well, what are we supposed to do? And I'm like, hey, like, we're here to tell you what's going on. We're here to report the stories. We're here to give you the statistics. We're here to arm you with the knowledge. And obviously, there's room to make suggestions in terms of policy implementation, things that could be changed, some sort of overall things to pay attention to. But as you mentioned, making sure that, people are listening, people are sort of moving closer to justice, people are aware of what's happening. And when you're aware of what's happening, you can figure out, what do I do? What is my role? Do I tell someone else? Do I write a letter? Do I get in touch with my legislators? Like, what is my role in this movement? And being able to figure out what that role is by being informed with the knowledge, but also not having the burden of saying, okay, I'm going to tell you how awful this whole system is, and now I have to solve it, right? It's like, let me tell you what's really awful and how you can start to think about it, and hopefully, do the work to make sure that we have things that are implemented that are going to turn this stuff around.
I mean, you glancingly mentioned, but you have personal investment in your own book. If you want to share, that's, I think, important to the discussion about sort of how we go about reporting these things with, we use obviously traditional methods of journalism, but we're also imbuing the narrative with a really personal, honest emotion that might not otherwise exist.
Yeah, I love how sometimes I completely forget that part. People are like, how do you just forget that part? It's almost like you assume everybody.
The reason why you're covering this industry.
Who voluntarily does this kind of stuff? Like, are you insane? That's what people ask me, right? Like, why would you do that? And yeah, so for me, my father served 27 years in prison, right? So as a young person, 5 years old, sort of having my father taken away, and then just spending the next 27 years in prison and really seeing what that looked like. And I think that for me, it really illuminated all of the issues that are inside of our criminal legal system, really just looking at the different institutions that, are also facilitating mass incarceration, right? If we're thinking about our education system, we're thinking about the school to prison pipeline, right? So really just looking at how is that contributing to mass incarceration, right? We're thinking about health disparities. How is that contributing to mass incarceration, right? Thinking about all of the different sort of issues. If I think about child welfare, right? As a young person, my mother died when I was 4, and my father, was incarcerated a year later, And so for him, it was a question of, how do I take care of my 5 children and be like, how do I take care of them? How am I present? And he was working at the time. I remember, being in the back seat of his Nova. He would take me to work with him. He was working on a construction site. He's there. He's banging on nails and building bricks. And he's coming and checking on me like, hey, baby, hey, Angel, how are you? Giving me snacks. And I'm kind of like, I'm cool. I'm playing with my Cabbage Patch doll, not realizing that I'm in the back seat of a car and my father is working, right? And even for him, thinking about, I want to make sure that my child doesn't go into the child welfare system. How do I make sure that I am present, but I am also earning money, right? But then being told that, hey, his boss came over and said, that's not allowed. You can't have your child in the car while you're working, right? And he didn't go back to work. So what does it mean to then, be pushed further into a crisis where you're thinking, well, how do I sustain economically, right? And we know that the industry of drugs is flourishing in Black communities in the 80s, right? So that gives you this place where you think, oh, I could dabble in these drugs, I could do this and still be home to take my kids to, to school or to the doctor or make dinner, right? To really think that that is a reasonable and sound way, but to acknowledge that it's because you're thinking about, how do I make sure my children don't go into this child welfare system, right? And we have a child welfare system that once you're incarcerated, it really impacts your parental rights. So if you're incarcerated and your children go into foster care, the likelihood of you getting your children back is very, very low, depending on what you're incarcerated for, how long you're gone, right? We've got ASFA, which is the Adoption and Safe Families Act. And that act says if you have a child in foster care for 15 of the most recent 22 months, then the state has to file a petition to terminate your rights. And that means that they permanently terminate your rights. So we think about all the people that are incarcerated now, and if they have children that go into the child welfare system while they're away, the likelihood of being able to complete treatment when you're inside. If you have a drug and alcohol addiction program or problem and you need to work on that, but there's a wait list of 6 months inside the prison, right? That sets you behind on your case plan. If you get out and you're in a transitional housing program and you can't buy a car because it's not allowed, and you can't, rent an apartment because it's not allowed yet, but we have a child welfare system that's saying, hey, if you don't have a car, if you don't have a place to live, you can't get your kids back, right? So all of these different social institutions that are in place that are not communicating with each other, that are making it so much more difficult when people are, in our criminal legal system. So, having a parent be incarcerated for that long, I just saw the gamut of everything, right? Whether it's going on visits and seeing the confinement of the visits, seeing the limitations of the visits, seeing, having to take off your shoes to be searched, all the stuff that happens that you only know to think about if you've experienced it. But being able to report in a way where you're saying, hey, now I'm going to go with these other families and I'm going to go inside this prison with them and I'm going to be searched with them and I'm going to sit and have dinner with them and I'm going to go and talk to his daughter and report those stories. But I think that because we have experience in this world, in this life, because we've been directly impacted, we are able to ask better questions. So I think that is an advantage of us being directly impacted, is that you're not just this outsider, the journalist on the outside that wants to tell this, awful story or this sad story. It's like, no, this is an important story and this is important work. And the reason that we're telling it is because we have personal knowledge that informs us of just how, detrimental it is to like millions of people, not just us.
Somehow Amazon still lists my book as a journalist biography, so it's beyond me. But we're talking about sort of narrative and journalistic craft and figuring out how we play a role in our reporting and writing. And I just want to encourage everyone, the participants who are here, to please do put some questions in the Q&A box, and we'll get to them in a little bit. But I'm curious because one of the characters in my book, or two characters in my book, Mike and Mark, have their father whisked away by federal agents, right? And is charged with a crime and sent to prison for many years. And they're sort of, not as many, not comparatively, but sent away for 2 years. And they have to sort of reckon with that and figure out how to grow as children in that atmosphere with the absence of their father, with going down to Virginia to visit a federal penitentiary. Very disruptive, no doubt. So how do you square your success with having experienced that when you were younger? And where do you find your strength to then come across as, overcome that into your adulthood? Whereas we see with Mike and Mark in my book, it ended up being more of a caustic thing for them, more of a springboard into trouble.
Yeah, that's a good question. Because a lot of people say to me, like, again, sometimes I don't realize how much I've overcome, right? So sometimes I'll get emails from people like, I was reading your story in the Marshall Project and I was crying and I'm so sorry. And I was like, what? Like, oh, right? But it's been so long that to some degree you feel so removed from that 5-year-old, 6-year-old, 8-year-old, 13-year-old that you don't realize how much of an impact it had. But it forces you to sit back and think, well, you're like, yeah, actually, that was, catastrophic. That was unbelievable. And I think I have to credit, a number of people, right? Obviously my grandmother raised me. So just living with my grandmother and just seeing what it means for her to be a strong sort of Black woman that decided, I'm going to take on a second generation of children, right? She'd already raised her children, but still decided that she wanted to take me and my 4 brothers in and raise us as her own, right? So feeling like I have to do more, I have to show up, I have to be present so that I can honor what she has done for me. But also my father was such a huge influence in my life. A lot of people would imagine that because he was gone for so long that we weren't in touch. But, you know, we had phone calls. He wrote me letters. I went on visits. And when I was old enough to take myself on those visits, I went almost every weekend, right? So having him be a person that tell me I can be anything I want, I can do whatever I want, and I am amazing and I'm powerful and I'm brilliant. And he said that to me. To this day, I'll ask him, I was like, yeah, some people say blah, blah, blah. He's like, yeah, I told you all that stuff because I wanted to make sure that you know, you wouldn't fall into a depression or you wouldn't, you know, succumb to what can happen when you don't believe that you are everything, you can be everything, and you can transcend what has happened to you. So just to see his strength, right? Just to see what happens in prisons. I think a big part of it is people think, oh, you're incarcerated, you're in prison, whatever you know, get while you're there, that's what you get. But I think I mean, that is just so far off, right? Like without even having to get into, you know, abolition of prisons, we can think about how prisons are run, right? You know, I had someone that was in prison for only 5 years. And when he got out of prison, he said, you know, I can't even sleep at night because for 5 years I couldn't sleep because I had to sleep with one eye open because I was worried that someone would come while I was asleep and kill me, right? To live in a place where you could be killed, to be in a facility where nothing is regulated and managed and they don't care about you as a human. How do you survive that, right? So I felt like he had this level of strength that really just showed up and just transcended. It was like, listen, I'm here. The amount of things that happened, the amount of people that didn't want him to make it, didn't want him to survive, the number of petitions, you know, he wrote to make sure he kept custody of his children, like the number of petitions he wrote, you know, the number of appeals he wrote, just really doing the work, getting in the library and learning and writing and becoming a new person. So I'm like, if you can become a new person after all of this, then who am I not to strive? Who am I not to take what's happened and make the best that I can out of that, right? And I have to also acknowledge that obviously, you know, it took a lot of work. It wasn't, you know, overnight. You know, I'm a non-traditional student. I didn't go straight to college. I had to take off years to work and support my grandmother, and just took a different path, but didn't stop. Just didn't stop. And I think that, you know, it can go either way. It really depends on what kind of support system you have. It depends on what kind of tenacity you have. And it depends on, you know, what people are there to surround you and support you and lift you up.
I think the major component here for me is just hearing that, you know, the grandmother was such a phenomenal inspiration and this strong woman who was in the household keeping things together, that sort of family piece that we're talking about, right? That if you have that base to return to, then it's so much more, it emboldens the child, right? It gives them the strength to find their own strength and gives them the comfort to come home to. It is a terrible world out there. You know, there's things you experience day in and day out, bullying, you know, just all sorts of violence on the internet. And then you come home, and if it's persistent there, it's just going to permeate every part of your life. But if you come home and you have that strong woman, that strong father, that strong family unit who was there to support you, you know, you shouldn't need to have a tough skin with your family. You shouldn't need to have your guard up with your family. You should be able to just say everything and not feel judged for it. And I think a lot of the children in trouble, as you know, had that difficulty. They were in one instance, or two instances, it was a grandmother who was taking care of the kids, and you know, she just was at her wit's end. And you know, I wasn't quite convinced that these grandparents had their own lives together. Which isn't to say that, you know, they're bad people or that they couldn't handle the kids, but they weren't issuing the same sort of strength that you're telling me helped you pull through when your father was away. So I think that's a really important piece that is being largely neglected in this conversation about the troubled teen industry, because we're focused so much on these programs and not really what is leading all of us in the criminal justice system too, to depend on these privately run institutions, to depend on these corrective units that are foregoing the real need of help and care for those in its charge. We have I guess 6 questions here now. We're heading into the last 20 minutes of the. of our chat, Sylvia, of our little hangout here. I'm in Milan, you're in Manhattan.
Yeah.
We're like, we're M&M now, right? M&M. So I think maybe we should jump into the questions.
Yeah, I think, is Maddie gonna read off the questions?
So I can go through them if you could just click on the Q&A box.
Okay, cool. Okay, so I'll read the ones that are definitely for you. Do any of these programs work, or should people stick to traditional therapy options?
Thank you, anonymous attendee. I appreciate the question. I think that there are lots of stories that come out of these programs of success. People who I interviewed for the book did say that their children came back better off. Most often, however, they came back better off and were really good at home for a short period of time, where the parents were contacting me not long after they returned from the program. So it's just not enough time to really decide whether or not the programs were good. What we do know is that when the children come home from these programs after sometimes a year or 2 years, they're terrified, like Sylvia noted, sleeping with fear all the time and worried about making a misstep and having your program extended. So they're apt to be very good in the beginning, right? To toe the line in order to not go back. It's not always the case that follows through into adulthood. You mentioned traditional therapy options. If by traditional you mean CBT therapy, then okay, I think so. But I'm really just pushing for a more community-focused approach to therapy. So if there's a local program that you could have your kid attend, be part of that program with them, see them, don't strip the bond of parenthood to send them away 1,000 miles and remove them from their social sphere, I think would be beneficial. So thank you for that question. Should we go to the next one?
Yeah.
Should I just bash them out? I'm sure you'll get to this, but what is the discrepancy between how troubled teens who are white from middle or upper class families and Black kids and kids of color who are not middle class or upper class are treated, and the differences of these groups to the school to prison pipeline? I think you should take that one, Sylvia.
Yeah, I think we talked a little bit about it earlier, right? But I think that it sort of does beg the question of, we can't compare them, right? I'll say that flat out. And I think you even mentioned this. We're not saying that they're the same, right? Because we know that the likelihood of you being Black, brown, poor in a certain community and neighborhood and being stopped by the police or being taken into custody or being arrested, Black people are incarcerated, I think, 5 or 6 times the rate of white people, right? So that's a stat that we know Black people are just impacted at a significantly higher rate. I guess I'm interested from this question in how you feel like the people in troubled were treated, right? Like once they did get into the system, did this financial sort of background help them, right? We know that, like, one of the other young men in my book, that his father was incarcerated. His father served 40 years in prison and he's still in prison. And this young man ends up getting into trouble, and it's the first time that he gets into trouble. And the judge has the right to use discretion. The judge can give him between 0 to 15 years. And I won't tell you how many years he got because you need to read the book. But it was an egregious overcharge, and the father felt like this was very racially motivated. And obviously all the statistics show that, yes, this is what happens in terms of sentencing. And also he just didn't have the money to bail out. So he didn't have the $100,000 to bail out. And I think it was only 10 or 15% of that you needed, but he didn't have that. So he sat in jail for 2 years. And you sit in jail for 2 years, you completely lose 2 years of your life. And then when you finally do go up and are sentenced, depending on what that sentence is, you have another 5, 10, or 15 years to go, right? So there's no recourse, and because you don't have the economic status, you can't bail out. So in the case of these young people in trouble, like, I don't know what their experience is like. Are you finding, we know that because their parents have the money, the $500, the $800 a day to even put them in these programs, right? Obviously, most Black and brown kids that end up in prison or in jail, their parents don't even have $300 to bail them out, right? So I don't even think we can compare the discrepancy. We can't even say that they're the same. I think they're very different, different things happening. But I think that obviously these troubled kids can end up in that same system, probably at a lower rate, but the likelihood still exists. So do you think that their parents' financial status was able to like get them out? Like once they were in that program and the program didn't work and they got into real trouble and they went to jail, could mom and dad bail them out? Could mom and dad pay someone off? Could mom and dad make the charges go away?
So sometimes the programs are state subsidized, right? Sometimes the kids are coming from foster care, and the state is paying for the transport of these kids and so on and so forth. But I think that the interesting facet of this is that the children who go to these programs and end up in juvenile delinquent halls or later county prisons, county jails, county lockup, they end up just becoming the same as someone who couldn't afford the bail, in large part because I think they keep getting bailed out, right? They start to do more harm because they're enabled over and over again and end up doing much worse things over time. And I saw time and again with the people who I interviewed a sort of detriment to the child because their parents continue to, so at sometimes they continue to not only bail them out, but then offer rent payments later down, like try to make up for this time and stuff to account for them being away and sort of troubled. But I do think that eventually it sort of merges because you're trying to prevent all said and done, you're trying to prevent children from going into the criminal justice system and then by and large failing. And then you have a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy where you become institutionalized, you feel more comfortable in handcuffs, you're more accustomed to the sort of roll call and the entry process, and that it becomes something that's much more a part of you, right? 2 hots and a cot, 3 hots and a cot, right? It's sort of better than a lot of things that people can get otherwise. I want to move on to more questions because we're actually getting more. Yeah.
I'll read this one for you. I'm curious about the research of these programs, about the reach of these programs and how they're able to insert themselves into families. Is it a matter of parents seeking out these programs, like going to them themselves? Or are these programs actively inserting themselves into communities, in a sense, scouting for troubled teens?
That's an interesting question. I think that they're not necessarily scouting, but they place themselves in such a way that when a troubled teen is called to the attention of, say, a dean or a principal at a high school, they know that there are these options for these children. They lobby to be able to say, we have alternatives. If the kid's out of hand and he can't go to VOTEC or she can't go to an alternative high school, we have these mechanisms in place to sort of take care of a wayward child. It is predatory in nature because they say that they have to be in these programs, that this is the only alternative, that it's proven to work. There's a lot of rhetoric around its efficacy that isn't exactly honest. And so they're not inserting themselves full force, but they are sort of like vultures hovering around. And again, I say it's through no fault of the parents that they choose these programs, because I feel oftentimes they're being misled. So thank you for that question. I guess we'll just keep going.
That's a lot. I got a good one though down here. You want me to read the good one?
Yeah.
It says, I haven't read your book yet, but it's interesting to me as I try to be involved with the school. In your opinion, what can a parent, oh wait, is this the one? It's not the one, but we're still going to take it. What can a parent do if a school recommends to talk to a counselor, but you don't believe your child needs counseling? What can one do?
That's a great question. I was just speaking with a parent who was once a troubled teen who went through these programs and then graduated and now has a daughter of her own that's in a private school. And she recalled being misdiagnosed very early on, and having those counselors make definitive decisions and diagnoses about a child without the proper medical intervention is disastrous. To say nothing of how quickly a child is changing at that point in their life, to say nothing of how quickly a child changed today as opposed to 10, 20, 30 years ago, is really difficult. I think that there are instances where counseling is beneficial. I think there is a need to have more robust counseling, that if you're going to take your child to counseling, don't trust the word of just one person. Trust the expertise of several, but also more importantly, listen to the child. I mean, they're so often absent in these conversations because they're unapproachable, or they're too destitute, or they're just not willing to comply or listen. And I think that that's the major divide here, is that we don't know what they need and we try to figure it out, but we never ask them. And it breaks my heart that we come to this conclusion that the only person who can figure out my family is a stranger. And if it's gotten that bad, then there are some other things at play here that I don't think a child is responsible for. I hope that answers your question, Gabriella. If it doesn't, just chime back in and I'll try to address any follow-ups you have, but thank you.
I'll read one while you're reading some of the others in your head.
Okay.
Can you speak to how society's negative view, even fear of adolescence, feeds this failed solution? And I actually think that, you know, we can go back to mid-90s, the 1994 crime bill, when there was this notion, Hillary Clinton, you know, got into hot water about this idea of the super predator, right? Like these young kids that were out and didn't care about anyone and would do anything and were dangerous and you should be afraid of them and we need to just lock them up, right? And I think that that's a perspective and mentality that's really damaging because we're not thinking about what the issues are, what are the underlying issues, how and why, and are these children really dangerous? What do they really need? What kind of resources need to be in place? Is it that we don't have, you know, support systems in our neighborhoods? In the case of the criminal legal system? Is it that we're looking at our school to prison pipeline and we know that these schools are under-resourced? These schools don't even have books and pens and papers, you know, all of the basic necessities to even make sure that they can try to thrive, right? So then we have this negative connotation of who they are and what they're capable of and what they aren't capable of. And I think that's a problem, is that we come as a society, many come and just say, well, this looks like a bad apple, right? This idea, let's just throw the bad apples away. So what do you think in terms of your troubled youth?
Yeah, no, my dad had said that the programs told him when I was admitted that being troubled is hardwired, which is crazy. And I think we have this disconnect with our children because we don't know how to relate to them because things are changing so fast. The things that they know, not what we know, or not what we knew at that age, you know, and everything is much more difficult to connect on a more granular level. So I think that it is the way we treat our children because we don't understand them. Conversely, we're not taking the time to really listen. I want to get to Emily Banks's question here. Having also experienced behavioral treatment programs, wilderness and residential treatment, I want to ask about what can be done to bring some awareness and better educate families seeking treatment options and school administrators who require a child's temporary or permanent removal about the potential risk of some of these programs. She talks a little bit about her time and what was gained, but wants to know more about transparent information. I've done a really poor job of this in the course of promoting this book, and I hope I can correct it, however briefly right now. But I haven't said enough that we need more voices. We need more former clients. We need more advocates for childcare to come out and speak about these programs. There are legislative bodies turning and working to introduce changes into the system to make things more transparent. But at this current juncture, we're starting from the ground up. And I think the more narratives that we have out there with people's names on it, with experiences from a wide range of programs, we can really affect change if we are honest about our experiences and if we can have a solitary unified voice. Breaking Code Silence, which is Paris Hilton's sort of project to promote the industry, to promote change in the industry, has done a great work of coalescing all these stories and bringing them together. But I think we just need to have a war of attrition where we let people know, we keep on telling people that these programs have issues until someone will listen, at which point then we could adopt a more transparent oversight, federal benchmark for vetting these programs and for licensing these programs, and to include, I think, as simple as small regulatory notes that say, look, this program has had X amount of complaints for this amount of things, just to have a modicum of transparency. But that, I think, comes later. It's just really important that everyone shares their stories now, gets in front of it, and is willing to come out about how terrible their experience was or how good it was. I mean, we just need a wealth of voices to sort of round out the entire narrative here. So, Emily, thank you.
Want me to give you the juicy question?
Yeah, I guess.
Oh, you sure? I think this is a good one. Suzanne Lowland. What has been the conversation Kenneth has had with his parents to understand and or forgive them for sending him to one of these programs? How are you getting along now?
I want to see if, okay, is she still here though? Yes, she is. Okay, good. Thank you for the question, Suzanne. we have a wonderful relationship. My father's my best friend. We've been texting all day. He's been following the book tour. He's been, sending copies to friends. He's very much a support in my career and also the book. We never had a conversation. I never sat down and said, this is how I felt about the program, in large part because I never felt that it affected me. I felt like I was a bad kid. I did bad things. I hurt a lot of people. I hurt my sister. I hurt my family. I tore my family apart. And I was responsible for what I felt like was the downfall of the family, the divorce that inevitably preceded my being sent away. But I learned later through reporting the book that I wasn't necessarily entirely responsible. I couldn't take that on into adulthood because I found that there were issues at home, that there were things that needed to be addressed. And I think it's not a matter of, forgiving them. It's a matter of empathy. Like, I'm a parent now too, to very young children. And I have to understand that what I was putting my parents through led them down this road. And it led them to this predatory school, these predatory programs that poached and said, look, if you turn out your pockets, we're gonna fix Ken. We're gonna take care of him. You just gotta pay us and it'll be fine. We'll take him off your hands. And of course, as a parent myself, if I was struggling and someone said, I got the answer, just turn it over, I'd be like, I buy into it too. I don't see why I wouldn't. So it's not a matter of forgiveness. It's a matter of understanding and really coming to the table and saying, I understand why you did this. Here's how I feel. I understand how you felt. And this is how I'm going to go about, reckoning with it for myself. And it's come out in the form of this book, Troubled. And I think that that's the conversation that most survivors need to be having with their parents is, I am not the person that you sent away. I was a different person then, and this happened to me, and I feel this way now. And if the parent is not willing to listen to you, then you can rest assured that the issue wasn't with you to begin with. And that's really all I'll say about that. But I really appreciate the question, Suzanne, and I'm sure my mom is proud to have me on the Harvard Bookstore website. I haven't asked her.
8:00.
I'm looking forward to reading your book. Thank you, Sylvia, for posting about this event. Gabriella, thank you. I don't know, do we have time for like one or two more questions?
Yeah, you can take one more.
Okay. Which one do you think we should do?
Oh my God, one looks like a 5-part. Yeah, you can pick whichever one you want.
Treatment programs at prisons have been outsourced to private contractors. System. How do we fix it? More oversight. All right. Yeah. So Kathy's question is saying that the problem with the industry is that it's been privatized, right? We saw this with private prisons too, and Shane Bauer's expose about the American prison system and how these contractors are for profit and therefore not for the correction of the inmates. You say, how do we fix this? More oversight. And I'm really not an expert in what should be done to curb the abuse that happens at these programs. I think there's something to be said for the training of the counselors, for the therapists needing more insight into the childcare that they're giving. The requirement for a lot of these counselors to work at these programs was just to be 21. There was no bachelor's requirement. There's no licensed clinical social worker requirement, none of that. So that is, a start, right? You can add more requirements to get someone in. Will that draw the necessary crowd into this industry? I'm not sure. But I think what I'm really preaching and hoping for here is that we won't need these programs. We won't need to send people thousands of miles away and have them locked up behind cages and screened windows and, being treated like they're less than. My hope is that we can revert to looking at the family unit, to saying what's not working here that needs to be addressed. Who in the family has left the center of the fold and needs to be brought back in, and how do we do that? And where is the community involved in this? Is it the responsibility of the principals who are sort of casting off the children as lost causes? Is it the parents who are not really learning how to communicate with their children in an effective way and maybe alienating them a little bit? There's all these things that I think come before regulating the programs. There are efforts, as I said earlier, in Oregon to sort of prevent very specific instances from occurring, right? The transportation industry has to go. That's just absolutely out of the question. No way to treat a child. And also the way that people are being held in these programs with the restraints and so on and so forth. So there are movements that regulate these very small parts of the industry, but by and large, taking down such a vast engine is just very difficult. I'm not familiar with the program that you mentioned here. The last question is, do you think the fact that these programs, no residential, that are community-based, are more effective? Do you think that it's just what I've been saying, is that community-based programs, and I mean community, I mean like down the block, like within the purview of your childhood home, and where your parents can access you and drop in and see what's going on, is very important. To say nothing of being able to communicate more effectively with someone who has state reporting tactics, who has to be vetted every 6 months, who has investigators coming in and out. Whereas with the private programs, you don't have any of that, and your child is often silent. So Kathy, thank you. I'm sorry it was a rushed answer. I'm getting the exit stage left symbol here. So I appreciate everyone for coming. It was really, really phenomenal set of questions. So thanks everyone. And if you do have any other questions about Troubled, please feel free to email me. I've been fielding questions for 2 weeks now, and will continue to do so. Kenneth.R.Rosen@gmail.com, and I'll get to your questions if we didn't tonight.
A huge thank you again to you guys, Ken and Sylvia, for a wonderful night in. Thanks to all of you out there too for spending your evening with us. You can learn more and purchase tonight's book, Troubled, through the link in the chat box. And on behalf of Harvard Bookstore here in Cambridge, Mass, have a good night, keep reading, and please be well.
All right, thanks. Good night, everyone.
See you, Sylvia. Bye.
Later.